All right, so um, this looks like a fascinating set of sources you've sent my way.
Yeah, I thought you might find this period interesting.
Yeah, it seems we're going deep into southern India,
hmm
between roughly 300 and 1200 CE.
Exactly, right in that sweet spot where the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas were really making their mark.
And isn't that kind of running parallel to some major shifts happening up north, too?
It absolutely is. While empires like the Guptas were having their moment in the north, the south was doing its own thing, forging a totally unique path.
So we're talking at a time when India's story gets a lot more complicated, a lot less straightforward than just one big narrative.
Right. And, we often hear about the grand narratives of the north. But to really grasp India's history, we need to understand what was happening in the south, too.
So let's get into it. We've got these three major players: the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas.
Yep, each one adding their own flavor to the mix.
Can you give us a quick lay of the land? Where were they located and what made them stand out?
Okay, so picture this. The Deccan Plateau and those coastal regions. That's our stage. The Cholas, now they were known for their impressive naval power, based along the Coromandel coast. And as time went on, their influence spread far and wide. Then you've got the Cheras, masters of trade, holding court on the Malabar coast. And further south, the Pandyas controlled the fertile lands around Madurai. Each dynasty, they had their own unique culture, their own language, their own ambitions.
So we're already seeing a pretty diverse and dynamic region,
Oh, absolutely.
even before we get into the nitty-gritty details.
Sure.
Now, the sources mention the Satavahanas as an important precursor to how political systems developed in the South.
Ah, yes, the Satavahanas. They ruled in the Deccan before our main focus period, and they give us a sneak peek into how those early southern political structures worked.
Okay, so what can we learn from them? What did their administration look like?
Well, for starters, they divided their territory into districts. They called them ahara, and each one had an official in charge, an amatya.
Amatya. It's kind of like the Mahamantras we find in the Mauryan Empire up north.
You
Right.
got it. Both were key administrative figures, responsible for governing and making sure those taxes were collected.
Okay, so a similar structure on the surface.
Yeah, you could say that.
But I'm guessing there were some pretty big differences that set the South apart.
Oh, there definitely were. One big difference. The Shatavahanas, unlike the Mauryas, really embraced local lords. They wove them into their administration.
So it wasn't just a case of conquering and imposing their rule from the top down.
Exactly. They knew that integrating the existing power structures was crucial for keeping things stable.
Smart move.
And this pattern, incorporating local lords, it would continue in the southern kingdoms that came after them.
It makes sense when you think about it, right? I mean, the region is vast, diverse.
Right.
A more decentralized approach might have been the key to holding everything together.
That's a great point. And this whole decentralization thing, it wasn't just about lords either. Cities and guilds under the Shatavahanas, they had a surprising amount of freedom. They governed themselves, managed their own affairs, and really added to the vibrancy of the empire.
So it was a very different model from the highly centralized systems we often imagine when we think of empires.
You could say they were ahead of the curve, recognizing the power of letting local communities run their own show.
And that probably contributed to their stability and success.
Quite possibly. And you can bet this approach influenced how later southern kingdoms like the Cholas, Cheras, and Pandyas structured their own rule.
So we're starting to see the foundation for a really distinct political system in the South.
Absolutely.
But what about the cultural side of things? What were some of the standout achievements of these kingdoms? I mean, the South had its own unique vibe, right?
Oh, culturally speaking, the southern kingdoms were on fire. Art, architecture, literature, you name it, they were producing incredible things. But to really get it, we need to understand how religion and politics were intertwined. Just like their counterparts elsewhere, Southern kings knew how to use religion to boost their authority.
Okay, how did they do that?
Land grants, my friend. By granting land and the revenue that came with it to Brahmins, kings could elevate their own status. The Brahmins got economic power and prestige, and the kings, well, they got to claim divine approval for their rule. Everybody wins.
Clever strategy. But weren't land grants happening in other parts of India too? What made the Southern approach unique?
You're right, land grants were common across India, but things shifted around the 10th century in the south. Instead of giving land to individual families, they started granting entire villages to large groups of Brahmins, particularly in those newly conquered territories.
So it's like a way to consolidate their power, bring those new areas firmly into the fold.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about control. Brahmins were often seen as the upholders of social and religious order. By settling large groups of them in new areas, kings could promote cultural unity and really extend their influence. It was a brilliant blend of politics and religion.
So a very calculated move.
You could say that.
You mentioned the Gahadavala dynasty earlier. How do they fit into this whole picture?
The Gahadavala is a perfect example of this strategy in action. One of their kings was super eager to solidify his control over a newly conquered region near Varanasi. So what did he do? He granted a massive chunk of land, 1.5 revenue districts, and over 100 villages to 500 Brahmins.
Wow, talk about making a statement. It shows how much emphasis they place on securing both divine and earthly power.
Absolutely.
Okay, so beyond these strategic land grants, what else defined the cultural landscape? The sources mentioned some pretty amazing temples, right?
Oh, the temples. They were more than just places of worship. They were grand statements of royal power, artistic brilliance, and they were centers of community life. The Cholas, for instance, they were famous for their awe-inspiring temple architecture, like the Brihadisvara Temple in Thanjavur. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site now. Imagine this towering structure, covered in intricate carvings and sculptures, a real testament to the Cholas' wealth and devotion.
I've seen pictures. It's absolutely breathtaking.
It's something else.
So these temples weren't just religious centers.
No way. They were bustling hubs of activity. Priests performing rituals, scholars deep in philosophical debates, artisans showing off their skills, pilgrims coming from all over seeking blessings. It was a vibrant mix of the sacred and the everyday.
A melting pot of cultural and religious life, all within these architectural marvels.
Precisely.
And speaking of reaching far and wide, the Cholas weren't content with just dominating the land, were they? They were a major force at sea as well.
Right. Under kings like Rajaraja Sirth and his son Rajendra I, the Cholas took their power across the Bay of Bengal and into Southeast Asia. Their naval expeditions, like the conquest of parts of Sri Lanka and that mighty Srivijaya Empire in Sumatra and Malaya, those were legendary.
They were a force to be reckoned with. But what was driving these expeditions? Was it pure conquest or something more?
It's a tough one. Historians are still trying to figure that out. Some say it was all about power, showing off their strength on a bigger stage. Others think it was about economics, getting those valuable resources, controlling trade routes, maybe even setting up monopolies.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It was probably a mix of things: ambition, strategy, maybe even a desire to spread their culture a bit. The sources don't give us a simple answer, unfortunately.
It's like a historical puzzle, right?
Exactly.
With clues scattered all over these sources.
Yeah, and it's up to us to try and piece it together.
So with all this expansion and power, did these southern kingdoms manage to hold on to their own unique identities? Or did they just become extensions of the north?
That's such a crucial question because despite all the exchange and influence coming from the north, those southern kingdoms, they really clung to their own character. And language played a huge role in that. Think about Tamil with its rich literary traditions. It was a powerful force in the south, setting it apart from the north, where Sanskrit was more dominant.
Right.
It's a good reminder that India, even within its empires, has always been this incredible mix of diverse cultures and identities.
Like a mosaic, right?
Exactly. Each piece adding to the beauty and complexity of the whole picture.
Okay, so we've talked about these distinct political systems, amazing cultural achievements, and strong regional identities. But let's zoom out for a second. Why does all of this matter? What's the takeaway for someone learning about Indian history?
The big takeaway is that India's history, it's so much more intricate and layered than those simple narratives of rise and fall or north versus south. By exploring what was happening in these southern kingdoms, we get a richer, more complete understanding of India's past.
So it's like adding depth to a painting. Right?
Yeah. Revealing details that might otherwise get lost in the bigger picture.
Okay, so these southern kingdoms weren't just a sideshow. They were shaping the course of history.
Absolutely. They weren't just passively receiving influences from the north. They were innovating, adapting, and sometimes even challenging the established order. Their story encourages us to dig deeper, to question those traditional narratives.
It makes me think about how these kingdoms, even with all their differences, they were still connected through things like trade and diplomacy.
Oh, absolutely. They weren't isolated at all. They were constantly interacting, forming alliances, trading, and sometimes, yeah, even fighting. That whole web of relationships within the South and with the North, it contributed to the dynamism of Indian society.
I see what you mean. It really adds another dimension to this story.
It does.
It's not just about memorizing facts. It's about understanding all these complex forces at play.
That's the beauty of history, isn't it? It's not just a bunch of dates and names. It's about human choices and the forces that shape our world.
All right, I'm totally hooked. But before we wrap up, I have to ask about what happened next. What became of these southern kingdoms? The sources mentioned some pretty big shifts around the 1200s, right?
You're on the right track. The 13th century, that was a turning point. New powers arrived, new challenges emerged. You had Islamic sultanates starting to spread their influence in the south, and the Delhi Sultanate consolidating its power up north. This whole new situation disrupted the old order, and it led to a period of conflict and transformation.
So things got a lot less stable for these kingdoms.
Yeah, you could say that. The 13th and 14th centuries were a time of massive change. Some kingdoms adapted and figured out ways to coexist with these new powers, but for others it meant conflict and eventually decline. But even when they declined, their legacy didn't just disappear. They continued to shape art, architecture, religious practices, social structures, all in the South. Their influence, it rippled outward, way beyond their political borders.
So their impact was much bigger than just their political power.
Exactly. Think about the Vijayanagara Empire, for instance. It popped up in the 14th century, partly as a response to the Delhi Sultanate's growing power. And you know what? They borrowed a lot from those earlier southern kingdoms. The Vijayanagara rulers, they loved building temples, they promoted trade, and they even took elements of the Chola administrative system and used them in their own government. It's a perfect example of how the legacy of these kingdoms lived on, even as new powers were rising and falling.
So they were building on what came before them.
Exactly.
It's amazing to see how those earlier innovations continued to have an impact.
It really is. And it shows us that history isn't just about memorizing stuff. It's about understanding the connections, the things that stay the same, and the things that change over time. It's about the human story. And when it comes to these southern kingdoms, their story tells us that even with massive change happening all around, innovation and resilience can leave a lasting mark on the world.
Yeah, it really makes you appreciate just how much these southern kingdoms contributed to Indian history.
Absolutely. And you know their influence, it's still visible today. You see it in the art, the architecture, the literature, even the political structures of later periods. They left a mark, a really significant one, on the subcontinent. And by understanding their story, I think we get a much better appreciation for the incredible mix of cultures and influences that have shaped the India we know today.
That mix of cultures is such a great way to put it. It really captures that richness and complexity we've been talking about.
It does, doesn't it?
It makes you wonder, though, how these kingdoms, with all their unique traits, how they ultimately fared in the face of all these changes sweeping through India.
Ah, well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And to be honest, historians are still grappling with it. But one thing's for sure, the arrival of those Islamic sultanates in the south and the rise of the Delhi Sultanate up north, those events were game changers. Imagine, for centuries, these southern kingdoms were thriving, building their own systems, their own cultures, their own economies. Then all of a sudden, bam, new challenges, new ways of fighting, new ideas about governing, it all comes crashing in.
So from a period of relative stability, things got pretty chaotic for these kingdoms.
You could say that. The 13th and 14th centuries, man, those were times of massive upheaval. For some kingdoms, it was about adapting, figuring out how to survive alongside these new powers. For others, it was all-out war, and eventually they just couldn't hold on. But here's the thing. Even when they declined, their legacy, it didn't just vanish. Think about the art, the architecture, the religious practices, the social structures, all of that. It continued to be shaped by their influence, particularly in the South. It's like you drop a stone in a pond, and the ripples, they just keep spreading outward.
So even though they lost their political power, their impact was still felt.
Exactly. And a great example of that is the Vijayanagara Empire. It emerged in the 14th century, partly as a way to push back against the Delhi Sultanate's growing influence. And guess what? They looked back to those earlier southern kingdoms for inspiration. The Vijayanagara rulers, they were big on temple building, they promoted trade, and they even incorporated parts of that Chola administrative system into their own government. It just goes to show the legacy of these kingdoms, it lived on, even as new powers came and went.
So in a way, they were picking up the torch and carrying it forward.
They were.
It's amazing to see that continuity, how those innovations from an earlier era continued to have relevance.
It really highlights how history is all about connections, doesn't it? It's about seeing those threads that run through time, the things that remain constant and the things that change. And when we look at these southern kingdoms, their story is a powerful reminder that even when faced with huge changes, human ingenuity, that resilience, it can leave a mark that lasts for centuries.
Well, this has been an incredible journey. Thank you for taking us through this period of Indian history. It's clear now that these southern kingdoms were much more than just a footnote. Their legacy is rich and enduring, and honestly, I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
The pleasure was all mine. And remember, history is full of surprises. There's always something new to discover. So keep asking those questions, keep exploring, and keep those deep dives going.
I definitely will. And to everyone listening, we hope you'll join us next time as we continue to explore the fascinating world of history. Thanks for tuning in.